A major shift in the tech landscape is taking place as the boom in artificial intelligence applications is fueling companies like Nvidia to new heights. And joining me to talk about the future of artificial intelligence is Amy Webb. She's the founder and CEO of the Future Today Institute and author of The Big Nine, which looks at how AI is reshaping big tech. And Amy, it's so great to speak with you again. And I know you and your organization put out an annual trends report, and artificial intelligence is touching every industry right now. It's the buzz on Wall Street. And how would you describe the current moment around AI?
Sure. I think the best way to describe it is one of unbridled frenzy. I haven't seen investors leaping into the type of activity that I'm seeing right now ever. It's a gold rush. They're rushing to invest in basically people and promises at this point, since some of the technology that's so hyped doesn't yet exist. But I think it's important to note that this is just part of a trajectory. So while current achievements in AI may be new to you, they certainly aren't new. And the truth is that AI has been touching every single industry now for several years.
And looking at that trajectory, then, what are some of the bigger trends or convergences that you're seeing unfolding around this technology?
So I think by this point, everybody now has heard about large language models and generative AI systems. These are certainly going to be at the forefront for the next, certainly, 18 to 24 months. But what comes after that are even more advanced systems called multimodal AI systems. And these are capable of performing myriad different tasks on their own. So not just chatting, but also on their own, chatting, learning how to play games, intuiting and interpreting what we are asking for in graphics and maybe operational design, as well as manipulating things in the physical world, like operating robot arms. So this unlocks a new landscape for new opportunity in business, but it also sort of spreads out the attack surface, which means that businesses need to start thinking through potential risks.
Right. And all these systems are going to require so much data processing. And I think what we saw with Nvidia earnings, data centers have become their main business, and their CEO remarked that there's just going to have to be a whole shift of how we think about these things, how we think about the internet. Can you talk a little bit about what that business shift is looking like?
Sure, especially as it relates to Nvidia. This is a company that really has been at the forefront now for many years. And the truth is that a lot of AI systems don't work without Nvidia technology. Now, this shift into data centers, I think, is a smart one, because it's not as though the average business has 10,000 GPUs sitting in a room somewhere doing all the processing they need. AI and the cloud really do go hand in hand, and there's specialized technology that is both on the hardware and software side, as well as new types of networks that are required to facilitate the promise of AI in a business setting.
And talking about the specialized technology, and I think what you have covered so well in all of your work and in your book, to reach the scale that we really need to power all this, only really a few companies have the capital right now to invest in that. Can you talk a little bit about how that landscape is looking in terms of who the winners might be here in the short term?
I'm so glad you asked that question, because nobody is asking that question. Because what we're really talking about here is consolidation. I think everybody's sort of been distracted by what chat systems may do and how someday AI may, kill us all after it takes all of our jobs. The real story, the thing to be paying attention to, is how are the dynamics of power shifting? And the reality is that as these effectively startups are starting to scale, they're blooming from small tools like chat-based systems into ecosystems and platforms, which means that they need to sort of hitch themselves to those big tech players, which is why you saw OpenAI and Microsoft, which really means Azure, sort of partner together. This is why we see Hugging Face and AWS partnering together. And of course, Google already has its Lambda sort of internal systems, but it's starting to open that platform up as well. What we see going forward is actually more consolidation. Even though we may see the startup landscape start to blossom and spread, All of this comes back to those enormous tech companies that have the compute, the bandwidth, and the very specific technology required to help everybody around the planet access these new tools.
Right. And I think just looking at Nvidia as a recent example, we're really seeing those investments and partnerships translate into some really huge revenue projections. Is that the way forward then in terms of revenue, or do you also see some cost-cutting measures with how these companies are going to use this technology to become more efficient? Is that how companies are going to be making their money from this?
That's another wonderful question. Again, I'm only saying this because I looked at and was to some degree a little bit a part of some of the hearings that happened in DC over the past few weeks. And these questions that you're asking did not really come up. So to answer your question, as the technology scales, we need more compute, we need more power. So all of that is true. And that will probably to some degree be a cost center for companies in the very short term. Now, I'm hearing executives wax poetically about how all of this new AI will mean a reduction in headcount. So they see this as an opportunity to address the bottom line. It's actually the reverse that's true. What's really happening here is an opportunity to address top line growth, meaning where do we derive new revenue? Where do we see new work streams? Because the truth is, it's going to be quite a while before these AI systems can completely automate what your human workers do, especially those in the cognitive space. So what I would be focused on are those companies that are looking at AI as a way to increase their top line growth, not as a way to improve productivity, increase efficiencies while slashing staff.
And I'm interested too in how the China market plays into all of this, because I think you've done such a good job in covering both of the US and China markets. There's some big tech players there as well. How is China factoring into this conversation?
So we don't really hear about AI in China, and I think partially that is by design. But again, in reality, there's just as much activity and just as much work happening there as there is here in the United States. And it can be argued that US companies are a little late to the party. So China has its own large language models, its own versions of ChatGPT and things like that. And it's also pretty far ahead when it comes to automation and robotics. And let's recall that in China, the policies toward data are quite different than in Western Europe, in the UK, and certainly in the United States, where privacy is more of a concern. That gives them a strategic advantage going forward. And I would keep my eye on Chinese companies. They have data, they've got scale, they've got compute, and they have the full backing of the Chinese government.
And as you mentioned, you were involved in some of the hearings in Washington, and I'm interested to know what your take is on, some of the regulatory environment around this, and what you see maybe as potential bottlenecks coming to building more powerful AI systems.
Well, over the past week to 2 weeks, there have been hearings, obviously, but also listening sessions. Different committees around the government and our elected leaders have invited folks within the AI community in to ask questions. And again, I think all of that is great, but it should have happened several years ago, and it shouldn't have been a sort of one and done. The challenge with trying to regulate this technology going forward is that it's going to be impossible to enforce those regulations outside of the United States, which means that the current headache we have with regard to the internet, which is quite splintered, becomes that much more exacerbated when we're talking about automated systems, especially as they relate to business. And I think our regulators understand that, but there are concerns about how this technology evolves going forward and the transparency that we have into how the systems work. And to that end, we did see Sam Altman come to Washington, ask to be regulated. Now, he's the CEO of OpenAI. And this isn't the first time that a big tech CEO has come to Washington, has come to the Hill and asked to be regulated. It's a little bit of theater. They have hearings, and then somebody's left picking up the pieces, trying to figure out how to actually make this work. It's much easier to talk about regulation than it is to actually create the mechanisms by which to regulate and then the enforcement.
Right. And it seems like any sort of regulation would favor the more established big tech players who are already overwhelmingly dominating the development of this technology. So I'm curious then, what do you think are the conversations that need to be had right now in terms of where this is going?
So I don't think traditional regulation works. Regulation and policy and the mechanisms by which that functions in the United States is really sort of old technology in and of itself. And we're talking about systems that were born not from academia, but from publicly traded companies or pre-IPO companies, which have different mandates. So my recommendation would be to take a longer view and to figure out a way to make sure that the technology develops in a way that makes the most sense for everybody while ensuring that the companies can still win. That's not a popular opinion because I don't believe there's any way to truly sort of pull the reins on development right now. The US can, have a moratorium and sort of prevent apps from being released or whatever, but that's going to bear no impact whatsoever on other companies and other countries around the world that are already starting to push the boundaries and get ahead. AI is part of every company and every country's strategy, and we don't want to be at a strategic disadvantage. So what I've been urging our lawmakers to do is to really attempt a different approach here when it comes to their regulatory frameworks. Unfortunately, that tends to fall on deaf ears, but we'll see what happens.
And in terms of investors, what do you think the big takeaway then is for those looking at this space? And what do you think the companies that are winning at this right now are doing correctly?
So here's the number one important takeaway for every investor. There's a lot of hype right now, but AI is a long horizon technology. So for those of you who are looking for quick wins, I think it's important to bear in mind that we are very much still in the infrastructure stage of things, the picks and shovels stage. And we've had a couple other previous periods in history. In 1970, when Marvin Minsky, who's one of the sort of forefathers of AI, told Life magazine in an article that basically artificial general intelligence was going to exist before I was born. This is ridiculous. We didn't have the compute power nor the networks at that point. There was no way for this to scale. And there's been a little bit of dispute about how his comments were interpreted, but the same hype cycle existed then, and it did in 1987, when again, sort of huge promises were made and they failed to materialize. What happened during these AI winters is that investors pulled their money back out. Now, it's possible that that could happen again sometime in the next 12 to 36 months if all of the enormous promises of the value that AI will create doesn't materialize. So what I would say is, if there are companies that you see doing foundational work, stick with them, because there are going to be enormous bumps in the road along the way. This is foundational technology that is going to take a long time to develop, but it doesn't mean to pull your money out right away when you start to see expectations being missed. You got to sort of pull yourself away from the hype.
Well, Amy, thank you so much for your insights. It's always a pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you.